Thank you, Maddie.
Yes.
So welcome everyone. This is part of our advocacy series that's focused on some of the most common challenges and questions that we come across with parents who are advocating for their children with disabilities or children that are struggling. And so thank you, Veronica, for joining us today and being available to help talk about this. So first, Maddie mentioned IEP. And so anytime we're talking about a family with disabilities or any of the resources that are available, we tend to default to acronyms. And so it might be, let's set the stage a little bit and talk big picture about what is special education? What does that even mean?
Sure. So, broadly speaking, special education is in Michigan governed by the administrative rules for special education, which is a fancy way of saying if your student is evaluated and considered disabled under the law, then you get special education rights. You get access to alternative classrooms and other resources that individuals who have not been assessed with a disability would not be eligible for. And so an IEP, Individualized Education Plan, is the method or tool that's most commonly used to provide these extra resources to the students with disabilities. The other thing I might note is I deal with a lot of parents, a lot of students, a lot of teachers who are very adamant that their student's not disabled, right? That it's maybe a disorder, that maybe it's a way they think or behave. And I just want to be very clear, the statute itself labels these as disabilities. And so when I talk about a disabled student, it's because that's the way a student would have access to these resources. It's not because I'm asserting that a student is more or less disabled than another. And I know for some parents, it's really difficult to talk in terms of disability. But if you talk to an attorney, an advisor, an advocate, right, that you have to classify them as disabled before their special education rights that they would be eligible for.
And that's to make a distinction, that's different than the standard for disability in terms of Social Security, or is it the
That's
same?
correct.
Okay. And so to be distinct, I know a lot of people shy away from that kind of label. They don't want their child to be labeled, and it can be emotionally confronting to talk about your child in those terms when they're struggling. And so to be clear, if your child is struggling with something, they may need that medical diagnosis. They will need that medical diagnosis in order to access services to help make them successful. And so, it doesn't mean anything. Don't let it mean anything. Or don't let it be a barrier to you advocating for your child to be able to get additional services. And so that leads me to, what is the difference between, so there's IDEA and there's what we call a 504 plan, which is, those are different. And it means that the child is, they're two different doors, right, to go through depending on I think the degree of challenges. But I think a parent should know what's the difference between those things, because I think that the school district may throw some of those terms around, certainly a 504 plan
Mhm.
versus special education under IDEA. And so if you could just highlight that a little bit, that would be great.
Right. So, especially with acronyms, let's roll it back a little. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. It is a federal statute, which means it applies to all states that ever receive any federal funding, which last I checked was all of them that aren't private schools, right? So if you're in a public school system, IDEA applies to you. Within that, and I mentioned it earlier, you have the Michigan rules on special
Mhm.
education, which line up pretty on par with the federal statute. And then separate from that, you have the Rehabilitation Act, under which something called a 504 plan exists. And so, with the acknowledgement that every attorney everywhere says it depends and it's not that bad and all of that, there's those three sort of separate categories. And what we're talking about here for IDEA, the federal statute, is individuals with disabilities, like we just discussed, and the rights to their special education. And so the statute funds these special education programs. Some of them include, if you have a student with autism spectrum disorder, they might get access to particular paraprofessionals, separate classrooms specifically geared toward autism spectrum disorder learners. And those programs receive federal funding, which means your students are protected from discrimination, retaliation, or withholding of these special education um,
Services.
avenues, right? Or possibilities. The Rehabilitation Act is different. The Rehabilitation Act is an anti-discrimination statute, and it is for students with disabilities, but it's rather than an access to education or an access to rights law, it's an anti-discrimination statute. So it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities who are engaging in activities within education. So a lot of times a 504 plan will come into play, and we can talk about like actual 504 plans, but the Rehabilitation Act was essentially established so that, for example, your student is in a sports program and they have a disability. The fact that they might need an accommodation, the fact that they might need extra help, different help, or some disability rights is not a good enough reason to discriminate and prohibit them from engaging. So if there's a reasonable access or accommodation, then the Rehabilitation Act would be your protection. The way this is different is that the education plan, it's your right to education. It's through your actual school system, through your district, and it affects how your student goes to school.
How do you know the difference? Like, how do you know what to, well, I guess let me back up a little bit, which is who triggers that? Is it a parent? Is it the school? Or can it come from either place when a student
So,
is struggling? So it might be, there's some kind of easy low-hanging fruit, like, well, if you have a diagnosis of autism and their child is 2, there are special education programs that start early. Like, that used to be Head Start. I don't know to the degree of funding if they'll still have Head Start, but there are special education services that kick in right away depending on the diagnosis. But, so that's easy. That's an easier entry if your child has obvious disabilities with a medical diagnosis. But sometimes it seems like to me, in my special needs practice, it doesn't always happen that way. And that's where you have somebody who's struggling with ADHD or learning disabilities that aren't necessarily immediately apparent, but usually appear somewhere in elementary school. Or in your experience, what triggers this when a student is struggling?
well, so a lot of times by the time someone's talking to me, um, something's gone wrong. So, it's unfortunate, but a lot of times people aren't looking for lawyers when things are going great and their students being treated really well. So, rather than my experience per se, I can tell you what I feel like a lot of the parents I know have gone through.
Sure.
And more than that, I can tell you what the statute says, which is either the school or the parent can initiate the process for obtaining special education rights. If a teacher sees that a student is struggling, they can have that student pulled aside, right? It's private, it's protected information, but they can recommend and talk to the parent about getting the student evaluated for special education. So that's one avenue. The teacher, excuse me, sees a problem with the student in some capacity or a difficulty.
Mhm.
Alternatively, parents have a right under the statute to request an evaluation for special education. After that, there's a lot of different avenues that you can go down. But something I always tell every parent I talk to is um, special education requests can ultimately be denied, but a request for an evaluation can never be denied. Under the statute, the school is obligated to process your request for your student to be evaluated. Now, I don't want to overpromise because some districts do the evaluation and decide they're not eligible for special education. But eligibility is very different from evaluation. And if you feel like your student may have a disability that's protected, then the school is obligated to listen to your request and to actually facilitate an evaluation.
So who does these evaluations? Do they have, is it a doctor, a PhD? Like who does these assessments if the school district is doing them?
Well, each student's different, and whatever their disability or perceived disability may or may not be really dictates who might be qualified to make the evaluation. The other thing is that the parent has the right to do an independent evaluation. The difference being that an independent evaluation is almost always paid for by the parent
Yeah.
versus a school evaluation, which is almost always paid by the district,
Yeah.
right? And so a lot of times funds allocation or just the ability to pay dictates that most of the evaluations are done through the school, with the caveat that if your student already has a some sort of qualifying disability diagnosis from a medical provider, sometimes that diagnosis can take the place of an evaluation. So by
Mhm.
that I mean usually autism is the easiest one as of recent because there's been such an influx of district educational services, because it's the one that's in my experience been highest as of late. So they've seen the highest intake of students that are recognized as autism students. Um, but if you have a medical diagnosis from a treating doctor that says this person has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, then if you submit that to the school, that official medical diagnosis usually is sufficient to get you through the education plan initiation, where you wouldn't need an evaluation. But if you go in, you think, man, it just something is just not right. I don't really know why my student is struggling. Then an evaluation will be done by the appropriate professional so
Mhm.
that they can figure out if it fits in one of the disability categories.
I think that that's where you mentioned earlier that if IDEA is a federal law that applies to if you're in a public school district. So we've talked a lot about the charter schools or private schools. What happens if you have a child that has either autistic spectrum disorder or is somewhere on the spectrum or is really struggling, has some learning disabilities? How does that impact the a charter school or a private institution? How does that do they afforded any protections if they opt out of the public school system or even homeschooled? I've seen a lot of parents that have children with different challenges, and homeschooling is safer for they choose to do that instead, for a variety of reasons. It just depends on the child and the circumstances and the resources of the family, whether they can do that. So if you could ask, I'm sure that I mean, it comes up in my practice. And so if you could respond to that, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so I'm going to try to take them one at a time, but I'm probably going to do it in reverse order.
Sure.
So, homeschooling is not necessarily a bar on special education rights. A lot of times, what parents don't realize, though, is that if you don't ask for it, the school is not obligated to voluntarily offer it to you. And that's true of most things within the special education rights law. So if you don't ask for an evaluation, like teachers can request them, like I've said, but that may or may not happen. If you don't ask for an accommodation for your student, they probably won't receive one because the school does not come in and say, oh, we thought maybe you would like this, right? And so a lot of times the parent has to initiate in some capacity. Um,
So let me make sure that that is such a critical point, because I have so many parents that choose to homeschool their children and don't realize that their child has a right to special education services, even though they are being homeschooled. So it could be, but they have to ask for it. It is not the obligation of the district to offer it. You have to bring it to the attention of the district, of the school system, and ask for these services, or at least to begin the evaluation process to see what they may be entitled to. So I think that is a tremendous point that I think so many parents don't realize that they have to ask for that. and that their child is entitled to those services. So that is huge, 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 huge. And does that, depending on the underlying issues, our state is the only one that I'm aware of, I think, in the whole nation that educates up to age 26. So there are parents whose children don't fit into a typical school curriculum process where they graduate, they're expected to graduate at age 18. So they would still be entitled to those services, even though they're homeschooling, correct?
Well, a couple of things I want to make sure that parents are aware of. When we're saying that the student gets these access to these rights and services, it is with the understanding that it will have gone through the evaluation process or the submission of paperwork or whatever it is to actually be approved for special education services. Because if you're not approved, then you're denied, and you can talk about if you need to challenge the denial. But I just want to make sure all parents and students understand when we're talking about homeschooling, charter schooling, whatever it is, you have to have been approved before we say they attached. But assuming that you're approved, then yes, the fact that you're homeschooling does not bar you from these services, right? And the I just wanted to make sure that was super clear for anybody who's in the process of actually trying to get approved.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you repeat the second part of your question?
I think it's just simply that that in Michigan, special education services end at 26, whereas most states end at 21, 22. And so even if your child is older and you didn't know that you were entitled to these benefits, is it ever too late?
So one thing is that it's not 26, it's 25 for almost everything under the IDEA, as far as I'm aware. Okay, so some services end at 25 though, and it depends on each student. And it's one of those classic lawyer sort of answers, but
Mm-hmm.
whether it's too late or not really depends on how long it's been and what you might want from it.
Okay.
And so kind of going back to what we said before, um, if you spent a large amount of time paying for services yourself or
Mm-hmm.
engaging in outside resources that would have otherwise been covered by special education, you might qualify for reimbursement. But the standard that I've seen is it would not be for more than 3 years retroactive. And
Ah,
that's not a hard line. That's just the standard amount of time that I've ever seen go retroactive because it sort of corresponds with applicable statutes of limitations for taking legal action. And
mhm.
so if you unfortunately have to do that and you're entitled to damages, the cap is almost always 3 years.
Okay.
And so usually if you haven't used it by then there's eventually a cutoff. You can only go so far back. So if your
Sure.
student is now 22 and the entire time you've been doing it on your own, I've never seen somebody get repayment or reimbursement for all those 18 years, right?
Right.
It would be limited in some capacity.
I think that's from a common sense approach. I think that if you don't exercise your rights, you lose them. And so
Sure.
that's part of the purpose of what we're doing here today is just to make people aware that, there are other benefits like within Social Security. I've talked about different triggers where unfortunately, if you have a child that's struggling or has certain diagnoses, there's no one who's going to sit down with you and say, these are all the things that your child is entitled to. Where would you like to start? Or here's a menu. And the menu changes depending on how old they are and what their diagnosis is and their challenges. And so that's our challenge, is to make sure that parents are informed that if their child has a diagnosis, a known diagnosis, or an unknown diagnosis and is struggling, what are their resources? And that, look, and parents are busy. They're working multiple jobs to make sure that food is on the table. And this is something else that is on their plate, but is really critical to make sure that from a timing standpoint, it is a use it or lose it. They have to advocate, they have to ask for the services to be triggered. So we talked about, so that's homeschool, right? But also, like, even in the public school system, you can ask and you should ask for an evaluation. It starts with the evaluation. Is that correct?
It can. Or
Okay.
like I said, if you have a diagnosis, if you have a student with a medical diagnosis, you can come in and say, I'm requesting special education, maybe not officially an evaluation, but I absolutely also in my practice preach, if you don't use it, you lose it, right?
Yep.
The other
Yep.
thing I try to also keep in mind when I'm talking to any parents or students is a lot of times people don't know what they don't know, and
Yeah.
there's a whole lot of information. And so typically when I come upon a group or parents or individuals just in general, um, I would highly recommend that you limit the amount of information that you're looking at to what you believe is applicable to your student, right? So if your student you feel like is being mistreated because they have a disability, then you might not be looking for an IEP, right? Because it's not about being in the classroom, it's about how they're being treated. And so a lot of times it's very overwhelming to see all of this information that you can Google or look on resource centers for. And then since you don't know what you don't know where to start. And
I
I
think that's a
always
great point,
tell,
Veronica, because if your child is struggling, it's hard as a parent to necessarily parse out, where are they struggling? Are there education issues, or are there behavioral issues, or how they're being treated by their peers that are contributing to these other issues? And so sometimes it's chicken and egg, right? Like,
mhm.
are the or are they different and being treated differently, which is then causing education issues? So it's just, but I think this is where um, I hear what you're saying. And from a lawyer's perspective, we always say, what's our classic answer? It depends, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's where, the education services that you're triggering, they might be, where you have to prioritize, right? And try and figure out, are education issues causing other issues, or are other issues, or like peer relationship issues causing other emotional issues, because it's not just about a child who might be dyslexic or have diagnosed learning disabilities. It might be emotional issues as well. So those are a whole other ball of wax that we could get into about different diagnoses. But one thing I wanted to circle back to was, what about this private school, charter school issue? How does a child who has, let's say, ADHD or other types of learning disabilities or autism, can they get special education services even in those private settings?
So in some cases, yes. And it's not an absolute bar or prohibition that you're in a charter school. But one thing that makes it difficult is that um, it's much less regulated than if you're in a standard public school setting. And if you're homeschooling trying to access public school, that's even more straightforward because you're still within the public school arena. And so I know it's frustrating and not necessarily the most helpful, but what's really difficult about charter schools and private schools is there's a whole lot of liability attachment issues that are very hard to assess on a general level. Charter schools tend to tend to have more requirements faster than private schools because they're not quite as detached as a full-on private school. But even then, in private school, in most cases, at minimum, you can request it. And in my experience, private schools usually have their own policies and procedures for trying to help students with disabilities. And so,
Because
one
to
thing
be
I would,
clear, they still have to comply with the federal statute, correct?
private schools,
Yeah.
it depends.
Oh,
I've seen
interesting.
private schools
Okay.
completely um, immune from it because they detach themselves so completely that liability can't attach.
So if we could dive in, let's take a minute and talk about what you mean by attachment, because
Sure.
I don't practice in this area, which is why one of the things I was absolutely loving about having you on. And so part of it is just to be able to understand what you mean by attached or detached.
Sure. So I'm trying to make it not sound like a lawyer. Um, in order for a school to have an obligation to do something for you, they have to have they have to be required to adhere to the law, right?
Mhm.
And in most cases, this is an oversimplification, but in most cases, the reason that the idea of federal statute applies to schools is because they get federal funding. And so the federal government says, if you take our money, you have to follow our rules, right? You have to
Okay.
play by our rules. And what's different about charter schools and private schools is depending on which charter and private school, they might not take those federal monies. And so the federal government does not have the jurisdiction to go make them follow the rules because the only way they have that attached liability is because they can say, if you take our money, you follow these rules, right? And so charter schools often have some degree of federal funding. It's much less than most public schools, but there's something there. And so you can, what I say is latch on to that to say, you have these obligations. You did take some of these monies, play by the rules, play by these guides, right? Um, Private schools, if they are detached enough, if they are so far removed from federal funding, as in $0 or almost $0,
Yep.
then you might still ask for it, which I want to talk about in a second. Um, but a lawyer cannot go file a lawsuit about it in most cases because the court will say, we can't make them do it. They're not taking the money, so we don't have jurisdiction.
They're not obligated under the federal
Correct.
law because they don't take federal dollars. And I am I'm quite sure that most families aren't evaluating that when they're choosing a private a private school. They may choose it for religion education, they may choose it for certain values or teaching style, like Montessori or other types of classrooms, that they may choose it for other reasons, not knowing that they may be compromising their child's ability to get access to these services that otherwise that they're entitled to. So how does a how does a parent evaluate that? How do they know what to ask for when they're considering enrolling their child in a private school or a charter school? What do they look for?
So, and this goes to what I wanted to go back to, which is, um, a lot of times, like I said, by the time it gets to me, something's gone wrong. But a big suggestion I have overall is the worst that happens, especially in this private school thing that we're talking about, is that someone says no. But the best that happens is that someone says yes. And so a lot of times, what I tell parents, and what was surprising to me when I very first started taking these cases, is how many parents didn't ask for it before they looked for a lawyer. They just said, my student's being mistreated or my student's failing classes or XYZ, whatever. And what do I do about it? And when I said, well, what did the school say? They say, well, I didn't ask the school. And so if there's nothing else that a parent takes away from today, please ask, right? Whether the school says yes or no, maybe you do take legal action. Maybe you'll say pretty please and then they change their mind. But if you don't ask for it, we don't know where we're starting from. And so private school, charter school, public school, ask for it, right? Sit down with the school, don't skip that step. And when you're looking for private schools, a big thing I say is do your research. The education that is a big part of it, right? But the services are as well, because in my experience in researching them, there are quite a few private schools that have their own policies for students who need additional attention. It might not be classified as disabled or special education. Some
Mhm.
of them are, some of them aren't, but they have their own policies. And so a lot of schools, private schools included, will have the policy to say, if you believe your student's falling behind, here are the steps you take, right? If you believe your student needs extra attention, these are the steps to take. And so between when you're choosing a school or if they're already in a private school, having a working knowledge of their school's policies or handbooks is a very, very good place that parents can start, where they have access to the information, where they can obtain it without a lawyer, and where if it's still confusing, maybe you need some legal help, maybe you need somebody to help you, parse through it. But you can take an affirmative step that doesn't require looking for a lawyer necessarily.
I think that's a great tip because I think that parents don't always know where to turn. And I think just simply, it's kind of one of those light bulb moments to me like, oh, you mean I need to ask for it? If you don't ask for it, you won't get it. And so the
Right.
idea is ask for it first, ask for what your child needs. And what I'm hearing you say is like, look at their handbook before you enroll, hopefully before you enroll or before a problem arises, so that you know what to look for. And they have their process on how to ask for help if your student needs help. And I think one of my takeaways is ask, does the school receive federal funds? Because if the school receives federal money, they should know whether they receive federal money or not and be able to answer that question. Then you know that they have to some degree, may be obligated to supply those, a robust response to a request for help. And so, or maybe even have the affirmative obligation to offer help under some circumstances if there's a known issue. So I know we can't help ourselves get into lawyer speak a little bit, but I think that these top tips are huge. Ask for help, ask if a private school or charter school receives federal funds, and that will let you know if they're obligated under the federal law to provide those services. And so, and the handbook, nobody likes reading those handbooks. I mean, they're all written by lawyers, frankly, and they're not easy to look at. But that, especially if your child is struggling, um, what are the steps that you should be taking? And I think that's huge, 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 huge takeaways for today. And so I think that one of the things that I'd like to see are, like what are some of the things that parents should be looking for? Like, how do you know if your child is struggling? I mean, it's kind of a dumb question, but it's not always obvious. Like if you see a child that starts, is struggling with reading, but is doing okay at a certain level, like where in the beginning of school or in the earlier years where things are really, I would say, well explained, spoon fed. Really, they're really going above and beyond to make sure everything is included and that child is super successful and it's very hands on. And you start to see issues like as the training wheels kind of come off and they're expected to do the higher the expectations. And so I'd like if you see any like common challenges or things that are kind of alarm bells that parents should kind of take note of on their own. Or I mean, obviously if during parent teacher conferences, that's one of the key issues there, right? Make sure you attend parent teacher conferences and have a robust conversation with the school teacher. But what are some other red flags that parents should be looking for?
Well, I'm going to take it one step back. In my
Perfect.
experience, part of my practice is that I like to talk to the students who are involved in the education cases that I am involved in. And a lot of what I have found in my special education practice is I might be the first person to ask the student themselves what their perspective of their struggle is. And
That's
so this is
really insightful. So don't just depend on what a parent was perceiving, actually ask the student.
right. And like
That's awesome.
with the understanding that it's not one size fits all. You know, this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I have several relatives who have special needs, and my two nieces are nonverbal autistic. And so I could ask them until I'm blue in the face. They will never tell me what's wrong in standard speak, right? It just won't happen. And that's okay, right? Not every student's the same. But if you have a student who communicates with you,
Mhm.
who can explain what's in their head, who can sit down with you and say, mom, dad, aunt, uncle, whomever,
Yep.
this is the problem because then I think that if you have a student who is capable of that and willing to do that, it's the best place to start. Because sometimes sometimes it takes some digging. Sometimes a student says, well, I don't like this class because it's boring. And what they mean is, I don't like this class and I get bored because I can't see the board because my eyes don't work right. And so now I'm acting out and now I'm bored and now I'm doing all of these other things. And in reality, if I could just be moved closer, if I could go get a visual examination for some eyeglasses, then I'm not bored, right? And so you can't always take what the student says at face value, but in a lot of cases, with regard to the Rehabilitation Act, the 504 plan, you know, students might seem to be disengaged where they were previously really excited or engaged. And in my experience, when that happens, when that detachment happens, I start looking at specifically those 504s and the discrimination issues, because in my experience, a lot of times it wasn't an educational disability. It was, I had an accommodation or I'm different from somebody, and now I don't want to do it because I'm treated different. And so when I sit down with the students, a big part of the conversation is, how do you think we got here? And then I talk with the parents as well. And then, engagement with the teachers, especially parent teacher conferences, like you mentioned, but engagement with the teachers if or when you see something changing is also important. So that disengagement, that detachment, maybe have a check-in and say, you know, they were really excited about your class. Everything was going great. The first card marking was great. The second card marking was great. And now all of a sudden, things are just not great. Do we know what happened? Did you see a change? Did you see a difference? And so one thing that I think is common among any part of what we're talking about, 504, private school, public school, it doesn't matter, is I feel like a lot of times by the time it gets to me, there's been a breakdown in communication.
Ah,
And I think that it's very important that you have the conversations and that you do so, hopefully with a mindset, with an open ability to try to be finding a resolution. Because sometimes if one party or the other comes in defensive or accusational, then it's not quite as productive as somebody walking into it just assuming or believing. What we're here for is just answers, right?
yeah.
And
Or
the
there's a problem, I
communication.
need help.
Correct.
My student is struggling. They need help. Let's work together. So what I hear you saying is that basically if you see something changing, don't wait to bring it to the attention of the teacher or reaching out to the teacher to see what the underlying problem is, but also talk to your child and ask them. And like you said, I really liked what you said, which is that don't just focus on the behavior, because the behavior might be a result of something that's going on that they're struggling with physically, mentally, or both. So it could be that, oh, they're struggling with reading, let's get a dyslexia. There's all kinds of other assessments. You talked about eyes and vision. It could be hearing, it could be dyslexia, it could be other things that are becoming apparent, that what you're seeing is the behaviors, but that are being caused by something else, by this other underlying issue. So I think that's really, really valuable help and information. And don't just wait for a parent-teacher conference. If you see something happening, talk to the teacher and sit down with them prior to a problem. But also, what I hear you saying is don't go in accusationally, saying like it's your fault. This is happening and it's your fault. Just
Right.
go
And
in.
so
Yeah.
accusations can go both ways, right? I've
Yeah.
seen schools, even if not accusational, defensive, right? What do
Right.
you mean you think we're not treating your child correctly? And so
Mhm.
in no way do I think it's always one party or the other. I don't even necessarily see a common theme so much as just something I ask people to be open to, is the idea, walk in less about how we got here and more about what we'd like to do from here. So if you
Yeah,
walk in focused on all of the things that came before, even though they're important, I think it detracts from the possibility that you can leave with a plan, with an
right.
education plan, a 504 plan, a safety plan, just a generic plan to go get an evaluation, whatever it is. If you're focused on how we solve it from here, in my experience, it's just a much better result for every single party, and most importantly, the student, who
Yeah.
needs whatever it is that we're trying to get.
And it can be emotional. It can
It
be a
absolutely can
very,
be.
emotions can run high. I've seen, like you said, it's a breakdown in communication. So just what I hear you saying is focus on facts, not how you feel about it or how your child feels about it. They're very emotional, right, about something that may be going on. And instead of focusing on why, right, like, or whose fault it might be, just say, look, they're struggling. They're not, my child is feeling this way, and coming to them from a spirit of help me help, let's get together to help this child. You should all be on the same side, right? So the assumption is that everyone's on the side of trying to get this child well educated, supported, and successful, right? Socially, emotionally, academically, all of that. So that isn't always the case, right? Sometimes, I mean, there's personalities involved and people are human, but I I have seen, just as an attorney, we see that when emotions come up, that can actually kind of get in the way. So focus on facts and problem solving together, right? So these are great tips. Um, so we talked about accommodations. We talked about what does that look like, and I think, and people asking for help. What does that look like? I mean, because I know that as a parent, I've gone through IEPs. And I think one of the biggest things is like, you don't know what you don't know. I don't even know what to ask for. So, what are some of the things that, if like most common things, or some things that people should know that it's available to them that they should ask for, and maybe additional resources? Like, one of the things that I mention a lot is it's a benefit of joining the ARC, that you can get a special education advocate as part of your membership. And that's an important resource that people don't realize. And it's joining the ARC is a relatively small fee. It's around, at least last time I checked, was about $50 a year, which if you get access to those education services can more than pay for itself. Um, so that's just kind of one resource. But what are some things that people should look for that they should be able to ask for, know is available to be asked for?
Well, do you want to explain what the ARC is? Because people might not know.
Sure. ARC is a nonprofit organization that is federal, and has different layers. There's a state ARC, and then there's smaller ARCs underneath that are regional, that are typically by county. So I live and work in Macomb County, and our ARC of Macomb is extremely strong, focused on service. It's one of, I think, our metro area is blessed by having really strong ARCs available, and they do benefit coordination. Ours has a sheltered workshop, and it's led by Executive Director Lisa Lapine, who is a colleague of mine who I went to law school with. So she's fantastic, huge advocate. And there's ARC of Oakland, which is led by Dawn Callanan, and she's a tremendous advocate, attorney. Um, I mean, just the amount of resources that they provide is amazing, along with something called the Eldridge Plan, where they administer special needs trusts, again, benefit coordination and support, as well as what happens to your student after they're done with school. So after programs, they're they are tremendous. But for student age, people who are in the public education system are eligible for age-wise, they are special education advocacy is part of their services that they provide as part of, if you're a member. So that was a very long organization, a long-winded answer, but they're tremendous. And so, yes, that's part of ARC as one of the resources that's available. So if you have other resources, now would be a great time as well. And what should parents be asking for?
Well, one place I tell parents to start if they already have a student who's been diagnosed is for their own providers. A lot of behavioral therapists, a lot of psychologists, a lot of doctors will have their own resources and referral services for similar children who are in whatever position that your student is in who's been diagnosed. And so, one place, and again, if you don't ask, it might not be offered, is to go to these providers, and say, great, you've diagnosed them, you're helping them, but how do we make sure that at school this doesn't go away? How do we make sure that at home we're doing the right things? And these resources are usually the most beneficial for the parents and students because they're coming from the same people who are treating whatever it is that your student is suffering
Mhm.
from. And then outside of that, the the Department of Education, both federal and Michigan Department of Education, have their own offices of civil rights. In their websites, like I said sort of earlier, it's like a fire hose. There's a whole lot in there that probably won't apply to you because it's meant for the masses. But I think it's a good place to start once you put yourself in your right little box. So on the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, it has a section on IEPs. So if you feel like your student needs one, if they have one and you feel like it's being ignored, right? They have all of these little subcategories. And instead of looking at the whole big picture, just go to that one spot that you need. Anytime that you're on a general platform, I feel like this is a risk, and it's a golden opportunity to become overwhelmed. And I just encourage even my clients is to pretend like you just have blinders on. If it doesn't have your three key words, just keep moving and
Yeah.
really focus on that. Um, the National Education Association has a whole section dedicated to parents. It's not just for advocates, it's not just for teachers, and it's not just for lawyers, even though they sort of have separate categories for all of them. They have a section for parents who have students who need special education. Um, I've not accessed it myself because I don't have a student with special education, so I don't have an NEA membership, but I do know that it's a possibility. And I can't really speak to the particulars of it because I've not had a client or an associate who's had it, but I know third or fourth party removed who say that it's good. So, with the caveat that I've never tested it myself, I know it's something that's out there.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess the thing I would say the most is if you're looking for resources, I would really recommend up front to find somebody that you really know or trust who might have somebody specifically to refer you to. So
Okay.
instead of going online, like I said with the medical providers, or if the providers don't have it, if your student is in special education and they have a special education teacher, they might have a referral. And so anytime that you can start personal, that's what I recommend to my clients.
Yeah, so it's like the classic, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? How you get there.
Yes.
So how does a parent know what's available? And I know this has got to be pretty situation specific, but in a general sense, what types of services should we be looking for um, that should be available? I know that it could, there's a huge spectrum of what might be available and asked for, um, all the way from a modification of homework assignments to, I mean, I think the top level might be a special education, special classroom with one-on-one, parapro guiding their every move every day, which is, I mean, that's a huge spectrum. But in general, I mean, as a parent who might be listening to this, what should what might be available? How do parents even know what to, I mean, you don't know what you don't know. So they may not even know what to ask for.
This is probably the hardest question I get asked is for someone, they'll call my office and they'll say, like, what do I ask them for? And the first question I always ask is, well, what does your student need? And it sounds a little bit silly, possibly, but if you don't stop to ask or really think about what you believe is needed, I think that's a very, very important first step that's often skipped. Because you know there's a problem, you know you need help, but if you have no idea what that help looks like or what is needed, then the person you're asking it of probably won't either. And so the very first thing I suggest is to sit down and say, okay, so it's reading. It's reading and something's going wrong. What is it that he needs? Does he need to do better? Does he need better instructions? Does he need, and like, again, don't be afraid to ask the student either. I there was a student who they weren't my client, but I was aware of them, and they were getting tested for dyslexia and learning disabilities and all, and it just, he couldn't see the page, right? He just needed glasses. And
Oh,
so sometimes parents, because and I don't belittle this at all, you care so much, right?
yeah.
And you just want to do the best that you can. And sometimes it's not quite as complicated as you think. And sometimes what he needs is, I just need to be able to see. And sometimes it's not that simple. But if you have not stopped to think about what a solution looks like, then the people you're asking to help you solve it will not know either, right? And sometimes that means going to a professional. Sometimes that means asking your student. Sometimes that means a meeting with the special education director. You know, if you're in a school district, in a public school district, and there's a special education director you can have a meeting with, they've seen a lot more students even than I've seen. And so to sit down and say, you know, these are the problems, this is how it's being presented to us, in your experience, maybe where do we go from here? And so, figuring out that sort of step zero before you start taking action, I think is very important.
How do they know when a lawyer really needs to be involved?
Um, I think that for every parent, that's different. And I think sometimes it also goes back to that personalities we were talking about. So
Mhm.
I have a client who, specifically hired me for much more administrative work, much more paperwork type of things, simply because she didn't trust that she could take her emotions out of it. And so she just knew as a person, I'm going
Mhm.
to yell at people. It's not going to be productive. I could do it myself, so a lawyer's not required. But in the interest of my child, will you just, be the advocate for me so I don't get in the way? And I think that having that personal knowledge of yourself is important, but also it really is so specific on each individual. There are some generics I can say, right? If you request something that's guaranteed, if you request an evaluation, if you already have an IEP and it is being ignored, if you already have a 504 plan and it's being ignored, I still encourage that communication first step. I still encourage go to these people. But if you have a district, a teacher, a person you have tried, and it's just a violation of these rights, of these laws, then at minimum, it might be time for a conversation about the idea of legal help.
Yeah.
Um, so usually broad scale, right? If you request an evaluation, if you request an IEP meeting and it's denied, those are pretty hard and fast things that public schools are not allowed to deny. Maybe you don't jump directly to a lawyer, but you can at least be thinking, well, that's just definitely not right. With some limitations. So a lot of people don't understand. You get the IEP meeting, it's guaranteed once a year. So you
Yes.
can request a second one, but it's not necessarily unlawful for them to say, listen, we just had one 3 months ago. Like maybe there's other problems, right? But what I would say is keep in mind that the obligation, they are limited for the school. There are things that they get to say no to. And there are things that you get once or twice, but maybe not as often as you would want. And so having some fair expectations, both parent and student, is I think important when you're thinking about legal action.
For parents who have a child who has been certified and is receiving special education services, um, is there anything that we should be aware of as far as like changes in policy, changes in enforcement, changes in budget is a big deal right now as far as what's happening at the federal and state level? Have you seen any rumblings or changes that parents should be vigilant about and be paying attention to in the news that may impact their child?
Not in the strictest sense of your question, but I think loosely related, and something that I think is very important for parents is probably the biggest issue that I see, that I wish I could go back in time and have them hire me earlier, is something called a manifestation determination review.
Oh boy,
And yes,
break that one down.
yes. And what it is, and we're operating a student who's already getting services, already qualified for special education, and then somehow gets in trouble. So a lot of times, special education students have attached behavioral issues. That's very common. And usually part of the plan is that you handle those in certain ways, right? And so these happen very regularly where the student will somehow act out and now they have to be disciplined. And under the law, if a student receiving special education benefits has to be disciplined to a certain level, including suspension, you have what's called a manifestation determination review. And it's a really fancy way of saying, do we believe that the disability is what caused the issue that needs the discipline?
Mm.
And what I see happen over and over and over again is that a parent comes in to the review and they sign a piece of paper that says, no, this was not related to the disability. And so
Oh.
the school moves on. And then the parent says, well, wait, hold on, what gives? My student's not getting this, my student's been expelled, my student's been suspended. And
Mm.
it's because, at least in my experience and in my opinion, the biggest place that parents make a mistake, or that school districts make a mistake, it's not one-sided, is that this review is cookie cutter rubber stamped. And
Mm.
schools almost never want to have a finding that it was related to the disability. And the reason that it's very important is that your student gets very particular, specific protections when it's considered as a product of their disability. And so a lot of districts present it as a foregone conclusion. This wasn't because of the disability. It was because of this outside issue. It was because of bullying. It was because of something unrelated. And the amount of times I've read a manifestation review where it was very clearly a product of the disability, but the school said no. And more importantly, the parent didn't understand what they were signing, and
Well,
you
just a
can't get out of
very,
it.
yeah, I mean, it's in legalese.
Correct. And so
And
my biggest thing, and it goes a little bit to your last question, but I wanted to make sure to touch on it. If you in any way, shape, or form do not fully understand what the school is presenting to you, at minimum, it is worth a conversation to see if you need help really understanding the ramifications, because under the law, a good faith mistake in interpretation is not enough for a lawyer like me to come back and say, well, let's try to get out of it, right? If you sign it, even on behalf of your student, you're stuck with it. And
because
the
they
biggest
assume
place, yeah,
that you're an adult, you're reading this form, you're signing a contract that you're agreeing this with the school, saying that these behaviors
yeah,
did not come out of the as a
Mhm.
result of their, or is unrelated to the disability. That is huge. Top tips today about making sure that you're advocating. And that is massive. That, I mean, I'd never heard those words together before and it sounded complicated. And thank you so much. You've just so many pearls of wisdom in today's session that I can't wait for. I mean, any adult, I don't see if there's any questions open, but this is a tremendous resource and I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us today. Thank you so much. So Veronica, how do people contact you if they need uh, advice or they want to retain you?
Well, one thing is that Maddie was right. I am partner, but with that, our firm name changed. So if you're looking for us, we're no longer the law offices of Lisa C. Ward. We're the law offices of Ward and Stachurski.
Okay.
But the good news is that there's not very many Stachurski attorneys floating around.
True.
So if you find me on my state bar profile or on our website, which you can still Google Lisa C. Ward Law, right? We have it auto direct to our new one.
Perfect.
But you can find us there. And I'm not sure if my contact information was shared on the advertisement for the profile, but if you go to our website, our Facebook page, all of it's on there.
I'll tell you what, we'll drop a link so that people
Sure.
can just click below. Now you're licensed in the state of Michigan. So if you're outside of the state of Michigan, is there a directory that you know? You could just Google special education attorney in your state and
You
or
can. And then the other thing is if you go to the state specific Department of Education, a lot of times they have, if not advocates, but they have links for where to start. And
awesome.
so uniquely, I'm also licensed in the state of Minnesota.
Oh,
I do not do special education over there because I just don't do it enough over there. But I know specifically if you go to the Minnesota Department of Education, they have a whole section for parents looking for advocacy or help. And my understanding from just other ones that I've looked at is that almost every state Department of Education has this. So I would start there, or I would start with someone that you do know to look for a referral.
awesome. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Veronica. And we'll see you next time, next month for our next webinar series.